All right, this week's Parsha 101, Parshas Pekudei. Parshas Pekudei is sort of a wrap-up and a refrain of Parshas Tetzaveh, so some familiar things from that. It also is the second part of kind of a follow-up from Vayakal, which went through about how all the furnishings and all the parts of the Mishkan were made, and Pekudei is going to focus on, kind of wrapping that up, and also on the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest, and of the Kohanim, of the priests, that all that was made also. And there's a parallel between Vayakal and Pekudei. Vayakal means that everything was gathered together, so it's the parts becoming a whole. And Pekudei, which means kind of like a number or a tally or an accounting kind of, and it's like an individual counting, so it's when, just because there's a whole, each part is still a significant individual part. That's sort of what Pekudei represents. Also, usually when it's not, this year is a leap year, so when it's not a leap year, Vayakal and Pekudei are often read together because they're kind of shorter parshas compared to some of the other ones. So the name of this week's Parsha Pekudei comes from the first verse in the Torah portion, El Pekudei Mishkan. These are the countings, the tallies of the Mishkan. And it talks about, it's going to go through now what was actually donated in a numerical form. So we talked. Moshe assigned all the tasks for the Mishkan, for building the tabernacle. There were treasurers, there were artisans, all this, lots of stuff going on. They had to teach how to transport, how to erect the Mishkan, how to take it apart, how to store it. This was going to be the jobs of the Kohanim, all that kind of stuff. And most of that, after Moshe gave instructions, Itamar, who is Aaron's youngest son, he was going to be in charge of overseeing the Levium, and he was going to be in charge of instructing them and teaching them about the storage of the parts of the Mishkan, the tapestries, the beams, the pillars, all that sort of stuff, because the Levium, the Levites, were in charge of carrying it, of putting it together, taking it apart. That's what they were in charge of. So Itamar was going to be the overseer of that, and then Elazar, who's the youngest, he oversaw kind of the Levium, the transportation of the furnishings, of the different vessels of the Mishkan. And okay, so the Torah portion tells us Betzalel did all that he was commanded. Then it actually gives us numbers. It tells us that all the gold that was donated for the Mishkan was 29 talents, 730 sacred shekel. So that comes out to about 1,404 kilograms of gold, or 3,095 pounds of gold. Then the silver that they gathered from the census, remember they had to give the half shekel? So they said altogether the number that came in was 603,550. That's how many half shekel they got. And together it came out to 100 talents of silver and 1,775 shekel. So that comes out to about 4,828 kilograms of silver, 10,645 pounds of silver. And they use those for the bases, and then if you remember, there's 1 talent per base. And there were a bunch of those, right? There were 100 of them. The bases is where they plugged they had the socket that they plugged the kind of the poles into for wrapping the tapestries around to actually create the actual structure of the Mishkan. So that's what all that talent of silver was used for. And then the rest of it was used to make the hooks. All of it was put to very good use. And then the copper that came in, this is not necessarily including the mirrors of the women, but this is the copper that came in that was used for the copper bases, for the outer Mizbeach, the outer altar that was covered in copper, and for all the utensils. So that came out to 70 talents, 2,400 shekel. And I tried to do the conversion on that, and I couldn't figure it out. So everybody just figure it out. But anyway, so it's a lot. And then also, of course, there was all the wools that came in, the scarlet and the turquoise and the purple, and everything that was used for the clothing, for the tapestries, and all that came in. Then now it's going to reiterate all the garments of the priests that were made. So the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, had 8 garments, and the regular Kohanim had 4 garments, specific to that it was punishable by death. They had to wear these garments when they entered the sanctuary for service. They came, they would offer sacrifices, or the Kohen Gadol, even if it was just walking into the inner structure, kind of the sanctuary of the Mishkan, he had to wear the garments when he came in. They weren't just allowed to, walk around in their jeans and the t-shirt. They had to wear these clothing. It was part of the service, it was part of their job and their service. So the ephod was made. The ephod kind of looked like a backwards apron with straps that went over the shoulder, and it went all the way down to the Kohen Gadol's heels. So this was one of his garments. It was made out of a 28 strand thread of the turquoise, the red, the turquoise, the scarlet, the purple, and the gold threads twined with linen threads. As before, some people are very they're very strict in the mitzvah of shotness. The mitzvah of shotness, that you're not supposed to wear a mixture of wool and linen together. The only time that it was allowed is in the clothing, is with the Mishkan, the clothing of the priests and the high priest. It was the only time that this was allowed to wear the mixture of the two together, wool and linen together. So that's why, sometimes if people, they get wool suits, they'll go to have, especially with men, they'll go to have under the collars checked. They have these laboratories. They know how to check to see if there's linen in the suits, because they sometimes use it to sort of make sure things are laying nicely, correctly, to give it kind of a shape. So they know also how to take the linen out so that you're not wearing wool and linen together. So, back to the ephod, which is kind of this backwards apron thing. It was made out of a woven design. It had the shoulder straps, and there was a belt that tied it together. There were two onyx stones that sat at the shoulder straps, kind of just rested at the top of the shoulder, and they had these two gold encasings that two onyx stones were inside of it, and they were engraved kind of like a signet ring. It says engraved, and it had the names of the 12 tribes on it. So you had 6 on one and 6 on the other. And there's different opinions about whether they were read across or they were read like in columns, whether they were in rows or columns, the way it was written. Then you also have something that's called the Choshen Mishpat, that they call the breastplate that went obviously on the chest. There was a material backing to it that was also made out of woven design with this 28-strand fabric, and then it was kind of folded over into a square, and then you had 4 rows of 3 gemstones. And these 4 rows of 3 gets 12, because these represented also the 12 tribes. Now, as far as everyone knows, these are from what could be deduced, these are what the gemstones were. So you have the top row, you have a carnelian, an emerald, a topaz. Then you have carbuncle, sapphire, diamond, zircon, agate, and amethyst, and then aquamarine, onyx, jasper. And then the names of the tribes were engraved on it, and it was like a signet ring that kind of, as in that it popped out. So they were as if you could feel the letters. And then they had gold chains that were threaded through gold rings that were attached at the top and the bottom, because the breastplate wasn't allowed to move around. It had to be tied across the chest of the Kohen Gadol, and there's this whole contraption of how it hooked into the back of the shoulder straps of this apron thing, so that way it was held firmly. So it was fastened around him, and the way it was held, the chains threaded into the engravings that were on the shoulder straps. It was a whole thing. Very highly recommended to look up photos of what these looked like, because they have drawings. People have created drawings of these things. Now, underneath all this, there was a turquoise robe that was worn under the apron, and at the bottom of this robe, there were pomegranates, these hollow pomegranates made out of material. They're made out of the turquoise, purple, scarlet wool, and they were interlaced with gold bells. And the gold bells were actual bells that rang when the Kohen Gadol walked. So he was heard when he was walking about. So it was set up in a pattern of bell, pomegranate, bell, pomegranate, bell, pomegranate, right? As explained in Parshas Pekudei. Now, everybody also had these linen tunics that they wore, and there was a linen turban. It's called mitznefes. That was for the Kohen Gadol. So it was a flatter kind of hat turban that he wore. The regular Kohanim, the regular priests, wore something that's called mikbah. It was more of a conical shape, what their hats were. It was not the flatter turban that the Kohen Gadol had. They also had linen trousers that they wore underneath, and there was a sash of linen and wool that wrapped around everybody to keep all their clothing, tied to them. Well, it was tied onto the tunics. Interesting, you have the linen trousers that they wore, and if you remember from many weeks ago, there was this whole thing about how you have to build a ramp for the Mizbeach because steps would not be tznius, right? Because if you walk up the steps, it's not going to look tznius, if it's going to be exposing the person who's walking down or whatever. But you see that even underneath these long robe-like tunics that they wore, there were still pants. They wore pants. But still, even then, there was still this consideration that went into the construction to make it a ramp instead of steps, to keep this modesty. Now, the Kohen Gadol also had something that's called, was a tzitz. It was like a forehead plate. So it was this gold rectangular forehead piece that they tied it to his head. It strapped over the turban. So there was one strap that went over the head. It went over the turban, and then on the two sides there were also straps was this turquoise wool strap that tied on the back. So it was tied with 3 different strands to keep it fixed on the turban so that it shouldn't slip. There were a lot of particulars about, you put on the clothing, and the clothing's got to, you got to put it on right, and it's got to stay, right? We don't want it flying all over the place. Now, then it tells us, Parshas Pekudei tells us the Mishkan was completed by the artisan, the rest of the Jewish people they donated, all that they'd been commanded. Moshe inspects everything, and then they go through the assembly of it. It enumerates each item that was done as commanded, like they built this and they built that, etc. Moshe blesses everybody, says, may God's presence rest with you. Then Hashem tells Moshe that on the first of the first month following the Exodus, so they're now in the 2nd year of the Exodus, and the first of the first month is the month of Nisan. That's the day to set up the Mishkan. So there was kind of like a practice week before that where everyone was kind of learning their jobs and they were seeing how everything went, of putting everything together. And there was like a whole consecration ritual that went on with the priests and stuff. But it was put together, take apart, put together, take apart. On the 1st of Nisan, it was going to be, okay, we're going to put it together, and now it's going to stand and it's going to stay. There's this whole thing about how the planks were too heavy for only one person to lift, which makes sense. How can someone lift an entire wall up? And Moshe, the Jewish people realized, okay, Moshe is going to be the one who's going to put this all together. And Moshe's like, how am I supposed to lift all this? And God's like, you do your thing and I'll do mine. So it was kind of that God sort of helped Moshe with lifting. Moshe's the one who actually fully finished erecting the walls for the Mishkan. And then Moshe's told that, starting with the ark and moving outward. So you're going to go then to starting with the Aharon, you go to the Shulchan, and the Menorah, and the Mizbeach Hazav, and then you go out to the Mizbeach Hanachoshes, and then you go to the Kior, moving outward with all the pieces and all the parts of the Mishkan. You got to anoint it all with the anointing oil. All the utensils, everything's got to be anointed, and you're going to anoint it, and you're going to make it holy, right? Everything's got to be anointed. You have to have Aharon on their sons. They're going to go to the mikveh before the Ol Moed, which is, we call it the tent of meeting. That's the actual sanctuary part. And you got to dress them in their garments. Then you're going to anoint them. You're going to anoint Aharon. You're going to anoint the sons. And this is going to become this everlasting priesthood throughout the generations. So on the 1st of Nisan, in the year 2449, because 2448 was the Exodus, the Jewish year 2448, the 1st of Nisan, 2449, the Mishkan was set up, and it was stood, and it was going to stay there until whenever they traveled. That's when it would be taken down. Moshe officiated the Mishkan the first day, so he did. He used each thing as it was supposed to be used, and then from there, Aharon was going to take over after that. They did the Torah, the incense. Then you have the daily Ola and Mincha offerings. Everything was set up then. Now, when that occurred, now you have the cloud comes down and covers the Ol Moed. It's the glory of God is going to fill the Mishkan. Moshe actually couldn't go in when the cloud was settled on it. It was like an intenseness of godliness there. And the Mishkan, they were now going to stay in this place where they built the Mishkan. They were going to stay there for the next couple of weeks. So from the 1st of Nisan to the 20th of Iyar. So it's about like 6.5 weeks-ish. And then the Jewish people knew when the cloud lifted, it's time to travel. When the cloud finds the new location, then we set up shop. And so by day, there was always this cloud hovering over the Mishkan, and then at night it kind of turned into, it was this fire that was visible, all can see it. That's when they knew, the glory of God is here now. And that's actually the end of not just of this week's Parsha, but of the book of Shmos. So if you're in Shul, you'll see in the Chumash, it says, Chazak, Chazak, V'nis Chazek, be strong, strong, let us be strengthened, and that we have finished this book of the Chumash.